Welcome to this week's video, which is about the growing power of conspiracy theorists. Harvard professor Daniel Ziblatt, one of the authors of How Democracies Die, talks about what he calls the conservative dilemma, which is this. How can conservatives win national elections with unpopular economic policies? Turns out, American conservatives have been quite ingenious with coming up with ways to win elections without majorities. Republicans won a majority of votes in a presidential election only once since 1988, and that was in 2004 when George W. won re-election. Yet, the Republicans retain enormous power nationwide. Today, I want to talk about one of their tactics which they have deployed with great success, a well-oiled propaganda loop. The era of extraordinarily successful Republican propaganda started off with Ronald Reagan, who was a master. One of his most successful efforts was to turn people against the federal government. Reagan, for example, famously said, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I am from the government and I'm here to help.'" One idea was that deregulating industry, keeping government out of industry's business, would benefit everyone. Another idea was that government is so inefficient that it's better to privatize government functions, which of course leads to a few people owning these government functions, which creates greater levels of income inequality. In fact, you can see what happened with income inequality in the United States after Reagan began deregulating industry. The chart is from economist Thomas Piketty, as published by The New Yorker and confirmed by other economists. As always, I'll put links to my sources in the comments to the video, so you can see things for yourself. Now you see, a way to break government is to make people distrusted. Alexander Hamilton, in contrast, understood that the way to give a government legitimacy and hence also create stability was for the government to help people and for the people to perceive that the government was helping them. So why did conservatives want to break the federal government? Well, after the civil rights movement, the white supremacists, the corporate interests, and white evangelicals found themselves with a common goal. Each wanted to dismantle the federal government, and each had its own reasons. The white evangelicals wanted the church to run people's lives. They wanted Christianity to dominate America. White supremacists resented the Supreme Court's decision to desegregate America, and they resented the federal legislation that made that happen. They understood that only a strong central government would protect the rights of minorities. Corporations wanted to dismantle the New Deal and the regulatory agencies that we got at the time of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So these three groups came together after the civil rights movement to form the coalition that now dominates the modern Republican Party. There's thus a direct line from Reagan's insistence that the government can't be trusted to the January 6th insurrection. Now, in a Bulwark piece entitled "Anti-Democratic Conservatism Isn't New," historian Joshua A. Tate shows that the American conservative movement has always been uncomfortable with democracy. Tate takes us back to the 1950s, that pivotal decade when segregation was ruled unconstitutional. Now, people who have read Democracy in Chains are already familiar with these arguments and the history. Democracy in Chains, though, focuses on economist James M. Buchanan and the modern libertarian movement. Tate focuses more on William F. Buckley, who founded the National Review, the magazine that influenced a generation of conservatives. Now, in 1957, William F. Buckley wrote a National Review editorial about Black voting rights in the South. He concluded that the white community was entitled to, quote, "take such measures as necessary to prevail politically and culturally in areas which it did not dominate numerically." In other words, the minority should take measures to prevail over the majority if it needed to do so to preserve culture. What culture might that be? Well, white Southern culture, of course. Buckley argued for the right of the few to preserve against the wishes of the many a social order that which the many, given their way, might promulgate. Buckley understood that the 15th Amendment was in the way. The 15th Amendment, added to the Constitution after the Civil War, gave Black men the right to vote. To get around the 15th Amendment, Buckley suggested that the South should deny the vote to marginal voters of both races. Now, Buckley and his pals cloaked all of this in fancy language, but the upshot was that some people are more equal than others. They were anti-egalitarian. They rejected the idea that all people are equal and should have equal voice. They also rejected a strong central government because they understood that centralization alone is able to foster uniformity and egalitarianism. Buckley believed that democracy was in tension with liberty. He and his disciples argued that too much democracy leads to tyranny. They worried about the tyranny of the majority. Now, tyranny of the majority means basically that the majority can vote to tyrannize the minority. To prevent that, we have a constitution that guarantees rights and federal regulations protecting rights. So in a functioning democracy, what the majority wants is limited by constitutional and regulatory protections. So, for example, because of the 15th Amendment, the majority can't vote to deny Black men the right to vote. Abraham Lincoln offered an excellent definition of democracy. He said a democracy is a majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. The held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations part is how we prevent the tyranny of the majority. So, when conservatives worry about tyranny of the majority, what are they actually worried about? A Supreme Court case from 1905 illustrates what conservatives mean when they say federal regulations interfere with personal liberty. So back before there were worker protections, the state of New York enacted a statute known as the Bake Shop Act, which made it illegal for employers to force bakers to work more than 60 hours a week or more than 10 hours a day. Conservatives argued that this law interfered with the freedom to enter contracts. The idea was that if a person was willing to work 70-hour weeks for a few pennies an hour, the federal government had no business interfering. The Supreme Court of the United States agreed and struck down the New York law on the grounds that it interfered with the rights of people to freely enter contracts. The case is called Lochner versus New York, and among other things, it serves as a reminder that in the past we have had quite reactionary conservative Supreme Courts. So it took a lot of work and about 30 years to get that particular case overturned. Now, when libertarians tell me that America isn't a democracy, it's a republic, I end the argument quickly by explaining that when I say liberal democracy, I mean this. A liberal democracy is a form of representative democracy with free and fair form of election procedures and competitive political process. All adult citizens are given the right to vote regardless of race, gender, or property ownership. That shuts them up quickly because very few conservatives are willing to openly reject this definition. They like to cloak their anti-egalitarian views in weasel words and slogans. Now, the right-wing propaganda machine really took off in the 80s. That was when Rush Limbaugh became a sensation. The Republican Party came to rely on people like Rush Limbaugh and later Fox News to turn out voters. The result was that after a few decades, Republican voters came to be sealed in an information bubble. They distrusted any source other than right-wing media. They were primed for conspiracy theories. Now, a lot of us have watched over the past 5 years or so as some conservatives have reached their limit. The Never Trump conservatives reached their limit when Trump won the Republican nomination. Many others didn't reach their limit until after the insurrection, when lots of Republican voters changed their registration status to independent. The result is that the voters who remain largely embrace Trump's lie that the election was stolen. At the end of May, 53% of Republican voters believed that Trump won the election. Similarly, another poll showed that 66% of people who classified themselves as Republicans said that they wanted to see Trump run for president in 2024. Trump controls these voters, which gives him control over the Republican Party. The fact that Trump controls Republican voters explains Senator Lindsey Graham's assertion that the Republican Party can't move forward without Trump. The Republican Party needs the voters that Trump controls. Now, as the Republican Party shrinks and hardens into a far right-wing party willing to tout a lie intended to undermine free and fair elections and willing to cover up for insurrectionists, its leadership will depend entirely on the voters who believe the lie and who support insurrections when elections don't go their way. Speeding up the process of the Republican Party hardening into this right-wing extremist party is Trump's demand that anyone who doesn't toe the line and repeat the lie be ousted from the party. Now, last week it was reported that Trump is growing increasingly fixated on the Republican-backed audits as he pushes the lie that he won the election. This brings me to MyPillow's CEO, Mike Lindell, one of the wackier conspiracy theorists. Lindell claims to have evidence of massive fraud in the 2020 election. Now, no one else has seen this evidence, and dozens of courts threw out these claims for lack of evidence, but that doesn't bother the people who are left in the Republican Party. In late May, Lindell appeared on Steve Bannon's podcast, War Room, and said, Donald Trump, I believe, will be back by the end of August. He also said eventually even liberals such as Rachel Maddow would admit that the election was stolen. To be clear, there are no legal means by which Trump can be reinstated. Lindell's bizarre theory is that all Team Trump needs is a shred of proof of election fraud to overturn the entire election. Meanwhile, Lindell and others are watching the Republican-backed audit in Arizona because they believe in a domino theory. They think if any Arizona ballots can be proven to be fraudulent, elections in other battleground states that Biden won can also be overturned. People close to Trump reported that Trump has been quizzing people around him about a potential August return to power. As was typical for Trump, he claimed that a lot of highly respected people, who he declined to name, were saying it's possible. Both of these sources said they decided not to tell Trump what they were thinking, which that he is not going to be reinstated in August. This raises the question. If there are people in Trump's inner circle who know that there's no possibility he will be reinstated in August, why don't they tell him? One reason, of course, is that he rebuffs advisors who do tell him to drop the whole stolen election story. The other reason is that to retain power, those in Trump's inner circle need to keep their voters engaged and the base riled. Dangling the possibility that Trump will be reinstated in August accomplishes this. Now, in practical terms, it doesn't matter whether a political figure is genuinely delusional or whether that person is cynically lying for political gain. In other words, whether or not Trump believes the lie doesn't matter, the effect is the same. It's worth noting, though, that Charles C.W. Cook of the National Review of all publications declared a few days ago that after speaking to an array of different sources, he is confident that Trump is truly delusional. Trump actually believes he will be reinstated as president this summer. Just yesterday, another story broke. The New York Times reported that newly released emails show that late December and early January, Mark Meadows, formerly Trump's chief of staff, asked the DOJ to examine the claim that people in Italy used military technology and satellites to remotely tamper with voting machines in the U.S. and to switch votes from Trump to Biden. Embracing this kind of insanity creates a cycle in which the Republican Party sheds itself of non-believers, finds ways to keep the true believers riled and engaged because that's where their funding is coming from, and thereby unhinges itself more thoroughly from reality. All of this makes the Republican Party increasingly dangerous. Also, as a result, conspiracy theorists like Mike Lindell have become wildly influential as their ideas are echoed across America from the mouthpiece of a former president who retains an iron grip on a majority of Republican voters. How will this end? As long as the Republican Party continues to embrace Trump or politicians who enable Trump and refuse to denounce his lies, the Republican Party will continue radicalizing. I did have an acquaintance yesterday tell me that both parties are equally extreme. So I'll conclude with this chart that I found in a book called Let Them Eat Tweets by Yale political scientist Jacob Hacker and Berkeley political scientist Paul Pearson. The chart is based on a systematic analysis of campaign platforms of the leading parties. It shows that the Republican Party is now positioned to the right of mainstream conservatives. The Democratic Party is positioned left of center where it belongs. So if I talk more about the Republican Party, it's because the Republican Party is posing a serious danger to our democracy. In this video, I hope to show that the rise of conspiracy theories in the Republican Party as a way to undermine democracy has deep roots in the American conservative tradition. Once again, thank you for joining me. I hope you're finding these helpful, and I hope you'll join me again next Sunday.